So my talk today is based on this book that I wrote, Jews, Judaism, and Success: How Religion Paved the Way to Modern Jewish Achievement. And the purpose of the book was to explain why Jews had such worldly success as a minority in the modern Western world. I mean, it's well known. It's well known among the public that Jews have done extremely well in the modern West. And by modern here, I mean everything from about 1800 onward. And the question is why? Why have Jews been so successful? That's really what I want to talk about today. Now, I'd like to make a point of clarification about the title of the talk because it occurred to me last night as I was looking at it, that there was an ambiguity here that is kind of misleading. The title, right, is How Judaism Promoted Worldly Success in the Modern Period. So the title could be understood to mean that Judaism promoted worldly success for all people, and that it did so in a kind of active and intentional way, as if there was some sort of grand program or mission in Judaism to bring everyone success. But anyway, Jews have done very well in the economic realm. In 2015, here's another statistic. Forbes magazine reported that 11% of the world's billionaires were Jews, and 20% were, and they made up 20% of the top 50 billionaires. Very impressive, right? And then, let's see, we'll go to the intellectual realm. Well, here, nothing illustrates Jewish success in general better than the number of Nobel prizes that Jews have won. From their inception in 1901 until 2015, which is where the statistics were current up to when I was doing the research on the book, 22% of all Nobel prizes have gone to Jews. All of this from a people that makes up 0.2% of the world's populations. The theory that I find most promising is what I call, or others have called also, the cultural hypothesis. Right? Jewish success has been due to cultural values that Jews developed over the centuries and were endemic to their religious culture. And I argue that Jews developed four such values in particular: human autonomy, freedom of thought and expression, emphasizing the value of life in this world, and valuing the intellect. Emphasis on human autonomy, and here I'm referring to autonomy in the metaphysical sense. Autonomy in relationship to God and the world of nature as a whole. Jews have tended to emphasize the idea that human beings are highly dignified and exalted creatures, even though God, is all powerful. Jews envision the relationship that human beings have with God as a partnership in which God gives human beings considerable power. First of all, how does this express itself? Well, first of all, human beings have been given power over the mundane world. They're supposed to be masters of the world around them, right? That's really the meaning of the phrase to be created in the image of God. If this power that human beings are given also in Judaism extends to the relationship that human beings have with God himself. In Judaism, God he's given the Torah to the Jews, and he's given it to them in order to give instruction about how to live their lives. But Jews also believe that they can then use their own independent judgment to interpret the Torah. And this idea developed in surprisingly radical ways. For instance, the rabbis saw themselves as individuals who could argue with God. And they could even win the argument. Right? And there's a famous story in the Talmud that many of you probably know, in which the rabbis are arguing over an interpretation of a particular law, and God himself enters the debate to express the opinion about who's right, right? A voice comes from heaven and declares, Rabbi Eliezer is the winner here. But the rabbis, much to our surprise, reject God's opinion. They overrule him because God has given Jews the Torah to interpret, and so God's opinion at this point doesn't really matter. Blasphemy, you say? Well, God's reaction isn't negative. It's quite positive. He laughs. He's amused by this. According to the Talmud, he says, "My sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me," like a proud parent. The emphasis on freedom of thought and expression. Well, this value follows from autonomy in the metaphysical sense. If there's autonomy in relationship to God, right? If you can even argue with God, you can certainly argue with other human beings. And sure enough, the literature of the rabbis is filled with debates about every detail of the Bible, right? All of its laws, all of its stories, right? Open up any page of the Talmud and it's filled with debates. And that's perhaps why Jews are so argumentative, right? The old joke, two Jews, three opinions. Well, this is where it comes from. The emphasis on life in this world. Jews have tended to focus on the present life. They've had relatively little interest in, when you compare religions generally, Judaism is notable for its relative lack of interest in the afterlife and the Messianic period. Judaism certainly speaks about these issues, but it's remarkable how little information there is about them. Very little in the Hebrew Bible. In the Talmud, if you've got an encyclopedic work of many, many volumes, discussions about the afterlife and Messiah take up only really, if you collected them all together, would only take up a few pages. Because what's the major challenge in Judaism? It's to obey God's will by observing his laws in this world, in all their mundane, in all its mundane detail. Spirituality is to be found in the mundane realm. So the rabbis were far less interested in talking about the afterlife and Messiah than they were about talking about what happens when my ox gores your cow. Why did this value prepare Jews for success? Again, it's obvious because it encouraged Jews to place their energy into this world, which is where the worldly success that we're talking about takes place. Not to worry too much about other worldly matters. Valuing of the development of the intellect. If you ask Jews why they've been so successful, the most common answer is education. Jews believed in educating their young, and education is assumed to be the key to success in the modern Western world. And actually, this viewpoint isn't entirely accurate. In fact, throughout the centuries, Jews didn't invest that much in the education of their young. That happened only relatively recently. What happened in the modern period is that opportunities arose for all Jews to become educated. And that's because of the availability of universal education in the non-Jewish world. Jews took advantage of those opportunities. So for example, this country is actually an excellent example of what I'm talking about. Jews fell in love with the system of public education in the US, and they went to those schools in droves. We should also consider the fact that these values were actually quite valuable to secular Jews, because these values would have helped secular Jews succeed in the non-Jewish world they were now part of. So it was easy. My theory is that it was easy for these values to be carried along subconsciously by secular Jews for generations. They didn't need religion, and in fact, these values were valuable for them to succeed. So there's a good case to be made that the four values continue to influence secular Jews up to, the end of the 20th century. Now, what Jews can learn from my arguments is, perhaps obvious. If they're going to maintain success they've achieved, I think they have to maintain their connection in some way to Judaism. The more they can immerse themselves in Jewish texts and in a Jewish way of life, the better chance they'll have for maintaining their success through the values I've just discussed. What about lessons for non-Jews? Well, the good thing about the four values is they can easily be adapted to non-Jewish culture. You don't have to be a Jew to believe in the value of human autonomy, freedom of thought, the value of life in this world, the value of the intellect, right? And in many respects, the Western world has already discovered these values, which was something I mentioned earlier. But what the Jewish experience does, I think, is that it sharpens the focus on just how important these values are and how well, when they were adopted seriously, how potent they can be in paving the way for success.